Ace Frehley stood in front of a wall of gleaming Gibson Les Paul custom guitars at the NAMM show in Los Angeles, his signature silver sparkle finish catching the convention center lights like 1,000 tiny mirrors. The endorsement deal had been finalized weeks earlier. $3 million over 5 years, unlimited custom guitars, a signature model line that would bear his name. Gibson executives were celebrating their newest partnership with the former Kiss guitarist, the man who had made the Les Paul Custom synonymous with space-age rock guitar. But in a temperature-controlled vault beneath his Connecticut studio, 3 battered, heavily modified guitars sat waiting. Guitars that bore no Gibson logos. Guitars that had been cobbled together from parts, spray-painted in his garage, and wired with pickups that Gibson would never approve. What those Gibson executives toasting champagne at the NAMM after-party didn't know was that Ace Frehley had just orchestrated one of the most elaborate equipment deceptions in rock history, and he would maintain it until the truth became impossible to hide. The relationship between Ace Frehley and the Gibson Les Paul had been cemented in rock history since Kiss first exploded onto the scene in 1973. That iconic 3-pickup Les Paul Custom, finished in silver with space-themed decals, had become as recognizable as Ace's silver makeup and smoking guitar. Millions of aspiring guitarists had tried to replicate his tone, that thick, sustaining crunch that cut through Kiss's wall of sound like a laser beam through fog. What they didn't understand was that the guitar they saw on stage, the pristine Gibson that appeared in magazine advertisements and promotional photos, was never the guitar that created the sound they were chasing. The real instruments, the ones that had recorded Shock Me and Cold Gin, were Frankenstein creations that would have given Gibson's quality control department nightmares. By 1984, the landscape of the music equipment industry was transforming rapidly. MTV had changed everything, making image inseparable from sound, and equipment manufacturers understood that a signature model from a guitar hero could generate millions in revenue. Gibson, facing increasing competition from Japanese manufacturers and struggling to maintain its premium market position, needed star power. They needed names that would drive sales, and Ace Frehley, despite having left Kiss 2 years earlier, still carried immense credibility in the hard rock and heavy metal communities. When Gibson approached Ace with an offer that included not just money, but creative control over his signature line, it seemed like validation. The Space Ace was being offered a place in the pantheon of Gibson legends, alongside Les Paul himself. The contract was signed in early 1985, and Gibson's marketing machine immediately went into overdrive. Ace appeared at trade shows, did clinic tours, and posed for countless promotional photographs with various Les Paul models. Gibson's engineers made regular visits to his Connecticut home studio, discussing specifications for the signature model, measuring pickup heights, analyzing his playing style. They wanted to capture everything that made Ace's sound distinctive, translate it into a production guitar that could be manufactured in Kalamazoo and sold in music stores worldwide. What those engineers never realized was that every time they visited, Ace was performing an elaborate theatrical production. The Gibson guitars were always prominently displayed, always plugged into Marshall stacks, always ready for demonstration. But the actual recording, the creation of the guitar parts that would appear on his solo albums, was happening through a completely different set of instruments, ones that remained carefully hidden. The deception required military-level coordination. Matt, Ace's guitar tech since the late Kiss years, became his co-conspirator. Whenever Gibson representatives scheduled a visit, Matt would spend hours staging the studio. The modified guitars, the ones Ace actually used for recording, would be moved into a locked storage room disguised as a utility closet. The cable routing would be changed to run through the Gibson guitars. Even the tape machine in the control room would show misleading track sheets, suggesting that the Gibson Les Paul Custom had been used for recordings that had actually been captured weeks earlier with completely different instruments. It was theater worthy of a Kiss stage show, choreographed down to the smallest detail. Ace understood that endorsement deals were built on illusion, the same illusion that had made a kid from the Bronx into the space ace. As long as Gibson believed their guitars were creating the Ace Frehley sound, everyone could walk away satisfied. The Les Paul Ace Frehley signature model that hit stores in 1987 was, by all technical measures, an exceptional instrument. Gibson's craftsmen had built it to vintage specifications, using the same construction techniques that had made the original Les Paul Customs legendary. It featured 3 humbucking pickups, the middle pickup that had become Ace's visual trademark, and it was finished in various colors, including a limited run of silver sparkle finishes. The guitar became enormously popular, especially among players in the emerging thrash metal scene who appreciated the thick, aggressive tones it could produce. But the crushing irony was that the guitar bearing Ace Frehley's name had almost nothing in common with the instruments Ace actually played. It was a product built on memory and marketing, a recreation of something that had never truly existed in the form that fans imagined. The truth began leaking through an unexpected channel. Studio engineers who had worked on Ace's solo projects in the mid-'80s started sharing stories in musicians' forums and guitar magazines. One engineer, speaking anonymously to Guitar Player magazine in 1989, described a session for Frehley's Comet's second album where Ace had insisted on absolute privacy during guitar overdubs. When the engineer returned to adjust microphone placement, he discovered that the Gibson Les Paul that had been sitting on a guitar stand was actually just for show. The cables ran to a battered, spray-painted guitar that had been hidden inside a road case with the lid partially closed. The instrument didn't even have a proper headstock logo. It looked more like something from a garage sale than a professional recording tool. But the sound coming through the monitors was pure Ace Frehley, that singing, sustaining tone that no production Gibson could seem to replicate. The technical reasons for Ace's preference were rooted in years of experimentation that had begun long before Gibson ever came calling. The guitars Ace actually used for recording were evolutionary creatures, constantly modified, constantly refined. One of his primary instruments had started life as a Gibson Les Paul Custom, but over the years it had been transformed beyond recognition. The original Gibson pickups had been replaced with custom-wound units that had different magnetic properties, different coil configurations. The wiring had been modified to create unusual phase relationships between the pickups. Even the body had been routed differently to accommodate electronics that Gibson would never have approved for production. These modifications created harmonic complexities and tonal characteristics that simply couldn't be replicated in a factory setting. Gibson's signature model was designed for consistency, to sound the same whether it was played in Toledo or Tokyo. Ace's personal guitars were the opposite, temperamental, inconsistent, and absolutely magical when everything aligned perfectly. There was also the matter of weight and balance. The Les Paul Custom is notoriously heavy, with some examples weighing over 10 pounds. After years of performing and recording, Ace had developed specific preferences for how a guitar should feel, how it should hang on a strap, how the neck should balance in his hand. His modified instruments had been chambered, routed out to reduce weight in specific areas, creating a completely different physical relationship with the instrument. One of his main recording guitars weighed barely 6 pounds, light enough that he could play for hours without the shoulder fatigue that heavier instruments caused. Gibson couldn't produce a signature model with such radical weight reduction without compromising structural integrity and dealing with quality control nightmares across an entire production run. The most crucial difference, however, was in the necks. Ace had always preferred thinner neck profiles than what Gibson typically produced, and several of his personal instruments had necks that weren't even Gibson necks at all. One guitar that appeared on multiple albums had a neck that Ace had, purchased from a small custom shop in New Jersey, shaped to his exact specifications, then fitted onto a Les Paul body through careful routing and refitting. The fingerboard radius was different, the fret size was different, even the nut width was different. Playing that guitar felt nothing like playing a production Gibson, and that difference translated directly into performance. The muscle memory Ace had developed over years of playing that specific neck profile allowed him to execute passages and execute bends in ways that felt foreign and uncomfortable on standard Gibson necks. The relationship between Ace and Gibson finally reached a crisis point. In 1990, rumors about Ace's equipment choices had been circulating in guitar circles for years, whispered in music stores, and debated in magazine letters pages. But Gibson had been content to ignore the speculation, focusing instead on the commercial success of the Ace Frehley signature model. When a detailed interview with Matt, Ace's guitar tech, appeared in a guitar modification magazine, explicitly describing the custom instruments Ace used for recording and including photographs of the modified guitars, Gibson's management demanded answers. A tense meeting was arranged at Gibson's Nashville headquarters, with the company's CEO and head of artist relations in attendance. According to sources close to the situation, Ace didn't deny the accusations. Instead, he did something that was completely in character for the Space Ace. He brought one of his personal guitars to the meeting. He plugged it into an amplifier in Gibson's own conference room and demonstrated, note for note, why the modified instrument could produce sounds that the signature model couldn't. He played passages from his solo albums, showing how specific modifications created the harmonic overtones and sustain that defined his recorded sound. Then he picked up one of his signature models, played the same passages, and let the difference speak for itself. It was a moment of brutal honesty that left the Gibson executives with no room for denial. The guitar bearing Ace Frehley's name was an excellent instrument for its intended market, but it was not and could never be the instrument he had built his sound on. The conversation that followed was reportedly heated, with Gibson's legal team initially threatening breach of contract lawsuits, but ultimately, cooler heads prevailed. The Ace Frehley signature model was selling well, particularly in Japan and Europe, where his Kiss legacy still commanded enormous respect. Having Ace's endorsement was worth more to Gibson than the technical accuracy of what equipment he personally used in the studio. The compromise that emerged was subtle but significant. From 1991 onward, Gibson's advertising would show Ace with their guitars, but the language became more carefully calibrated. Instead of claiming the signature model was the guitar Ace uses, advertisements would refer to it as inspired by Ace's legendary tone, or capturing the spirit of the Space Ace's sound. It was corporate doublespeak that allowed both parties to maintain the relationship while acknowledging, however indirectly, that the truth was more complicated than the marketing suggested. The story took an unexpected turn in 1996 when Ace rejoined Kiss for their massively successful reunion tour. Suddenly, he was back on the world's biggest stages, and the vintage silver Les Paul Custom became part of the show again. But veteran Kiss fans noticed something interesting. During extended guitar solos, when the cameras cut away and the spotlight isolated Ace in a cone of blue light, the guitar he was playing looked different from the pristine Gibsons in the promotional materials. Bootleg recordings from various tour stops revealed subtle differences in tone from night to night, suggesting that multiple guitars were being rotated through the set. Some nights the tone was thick and creamy, classic Gibson, humbucker warmth. Other nights it was more cutting, more aggressive, with harmonic characteristics that didn't match any production Les Paul. The truth was that Ace was using a combination of instruments, mixing genuine Gibson guitars for certain songs with his modified personal instruments for parts that required his specific recorded sound. It was a practical solution to an impossible situation, giving Gibson the visual endorsement they needed while allowing Ace the sonic flexibility he required. Wolf Van Halen's counterpart in this story was Ace's daughter Monique, who had spent time around her father's studios since childhood. In interviews years later, she confirmed what many had suspected. Her father had always been obsessive about his guitars in a way that went far beyond normal musician equipment preferences. She described watching him spend hours adjusting pickup heights, changing capacitor values in the tone circuits, even experimenting with different types of wire for internal connections. The Gibson signature model guitars were used, Monique explained, but primarily for rhythm parts, where consistency and reliability were more important than the specific tonal characteristics that defined his lead sound. For solos, for the melodic passages that carried emotional weight, Ace always returned to his personal instruments. It was the guitar equivalent of a painter having specific brushes for specific techniques. Theoretically, any professional brush could apply paint to canvas, but that one particular brush created the exact stroke, the exact texture that the artist's vision required. The Gibson signature model story became legendary in guitar collecting circles, a cautionary tale about the gulf between endorsed equipment and actually used equipment. But it also revealed something essential about Ace Frehley's character. He wasn't a sellout who abandoned his artistic principles for a paycheck, nor was he a purist who refused to participate in the commercial machinery of the music industry. He existed in the middle ground, finding ways to satisfy both his business obligations and his creative requirements. The deception, if it could even be called that, was pragmatic rather than malicious. Ace understood that the music equipment industry operated on perception, that his association with Gibson provided value regardless of what instruments he personally used in the studio. He was giving Gibson exactly what they had paid for: his name, his credibility, and his presence at promotional events. What happened in the privacy of his home studio was between him and his music. The technical obsession that drove Ace's equipment modifications reflected a deeper truth about his relationship with music. He was never the most technical player in rock guitar, never the fastest or the most theoretically sophisticated. What made Ace special was his tone, his touch, the way he could make a guitar sing with emotion that transcended technical proficiency. That quality couldn't be mass-produced, couldn't be captured in factory specifications or replicated in a signature model. It lived in the relationship between his hands and those specific instruments, guitars that had been shaped by years of modifications to become extensions of his musical voice. The signature model could give a player the look of Ace Frehley, the visual aesthetic that connected to Kiss's theatrical legacy. But the sound, the real sound, required something that couldn't be purchased in a music store. When Ace Frehley released his Space Invader album in 2014, guitar enthusiasts noticed something interesting in the album credits. The equipment list was unusually detailed, mentioning specific guitar serial numbers and describing modifications in technical language. It was as if Ace had decided, after decades of compromises and carefully managed endorsements, to simply tell the truth. Among the guitars listed were several that had no manufacturer names attached, described only by their specifications and modifications. One was simply listed as Silver Custom, modified pickups, custom neck, chambered body. No Gibson logo appeared in the description. It was a quiet acknowledgement that the guitars that mattered, the ones that actually created the Space Invader sound, were instruments that existed outside the commercial equipment ecosystem entirely. Today, the original Ace Frehley signature model Les Pauls, especially the silver sparkle versions from the initial 1987 run, are valuable collector's items selling for thousands of dollars above their original retail price. But they're prized not because they were the secret to Ace's recorded sound, but because they represent a specific moment in rock guitar history when the Space Ace's legend intersected with Gibson's storied legacy. They're beautiful instruments, well-crafted and perfectly functional, but they're artifacts of marketing rather than of musical creation. The actual guitars that recorded Rock Soldiers and Into the Night, the instruments that captured the essence of Ace Frehley's playing, remain in private collections, too historically significant and too personally valuable to ever be displayed publicly. Those guitars, battered and modified and utterly unique, are the real monuments to Ace's craftsmanship and sonic obsession. The equipment deception story offers a window into a larger truth about the music industry, the eternal tension between art and commerce, between personal vision and commercial viability. Endorsement deals exist in a strange liminal space where authenticity becomes a negotiable commodity. Companies need the credibility that comes from association with legendary artists. But those artists need creative freedom to maintain the qualities that made them legendary in the first place. The result is often a carefully choreographed dance where everyone gets what they need, even if the underlying reality differs dramatically from the public presentation. Ace Frehley understood this dance better than most, having spent years behind Kiss's elaborate makeup and costumes, performing a character that was simultaneously genuine and theatrical. The equipment deception was just another form of performance, another layer of the Space Ace mythology. In the end, perhaps the most profound legacy of this story is what it says about the nature of tone and the relationship between musicians and their instruments. Every serious guitarist knows that great tone doesn't come from equipment alone. It lives in the player's hands, in their touch, in the countless hours of experimentation and refinement that develop a personal voice. The signature model was Gibson's attempt to bottle that voice, to make it available to anyone with a credit card. But some things can't be productized, can't be reduced to specifications and manufacturing tolerances. Ace Frehley's tone was the result of decades of obsessive tinkering, of modifications, stacked on modifications, of instruments evolved specifically to match his playing style and sonic vision. The Gibson signature model could give a player a starting point, a guitar that evoked the visual aesthetic of the Space Ace. But the rest of the journey, the path to developing a personal voice on the instrument, was something each player had to discover alone. The story came full circle in 2020 when Gibson released a limited reissue of the original Ace Frehley signature model, marketed as a collector's edition, with period-accurate specifications and finishes. The promotional materials were notably different from the original 1987 advertising, acknowledging openly that the guitar represented a tribute to Ace's visual legacy with Kiss, rather than claiming to replicate his actual recorded sound. It was a small shift in language, but it represented a larger industry-wide acknowledgement that signature models exist in their own category, separate from the personal instruments that artists actually use to create their music. Some guitarists who purchased the reissue were satisfied with the disclaimer, appreciating the guitar as a well-made instrument that connected them to a piece of rock history. Others felt vindicated in their decades-long suspicion that something about the original signature model story hadn't quite added up. Ace Frehley himself, now in his 70s and still touring occasionally, seems amused by the whole saga when asked about it in interviews. He doesn't deny the deception, but he doesn't apologize for it either. In his view, the signature model served its purpose, giving Gibson what they needed and giving him the resources to continue making music on his own terms. The modified guitars he actually used for recording were never meant to be products, never intended for mass production. They were personal tools, evolved over time to meet his specific needs, and their value couldn't be measured in dollars or quantified in sales figures. They were, quite simply, the instruments through which the Space Ace's voice emerged, and that voice was never going to fit neatly into a factory specification sheet or a marketing department's vision of what an Ace Frehley guitar should be.